Guyana's oil and gas industry has transformed the country's economic landscape, creating new opportunities while raising complex legal and regulatory questions. As the sector expands, issues surrounding local content, corporate partnerships, and transparency remain at the center of national discussion. This week on Sources, I speak with Guyanese Attorney-at-Law and author Brenden Glasford, who offers his legal perspective on the Local Content Act, its implementation, and the ongoing debate surrounding fronting, beneficial ownership, and joint ventures in the oil and gas sector. The conversation also explores the role a development bank could play in supporting local businesses and the legal framework needed to strengthen Guyana's growing petroleum economy. As the industry continues to evolve, the discussion considers whether Guyana's laws are keeping pace with the country's rapid development. Welcome to Sources. I'm your host, Svetlana Marshall. This evening, I'm speaking with Attorney-at-Law and author, Mr. Brenden Glasford. Mr. Glasford, welcome to Sources.
Hey, thanks for having me, and good evening to all the listeners out there.
Now, I've seen you on TikTok. I know that you specialize in a sense in commercial law, but tell me who you are, your history in law, why you chose law in the first place, and some of the sectors you've served in.
Okay, well, why I chose law, I come from a line of lawyers. My grandfather was Rex McKay. My mother, aunt, and uncle are also lawyers. So I grew up around law. I didn't really think too seriously about it until I had finished secondary school, and then I went to UG. I did my training here. The legal education certificate I did in Trinidad. I graduated in 2013. I've been practicing for 13 years, and I've tried to get as much experience. At one time, like you said, I did a 6-month stint as a magistrate to reduce the backlog between 2016 and 2017. I heard a few hundred cases in that time, a lot of petty matters, some traffic cases, a few police matters, a few small criminal cases, stuff like that. In addition to that, I used to work with McKay & Moore, which was my grandfather's firm, up until the time that he died. I took a stint also. I worked as I worked in government as an advisor with the State Assets Recovery Agency from 2017 to 2020. And from 2024 to the middle of 2025, I worked with a Spain-based law firm called Leshen and Niguez and Partners, doing a lot of transactions both locally and in some parts of West Africa, like Ghana and Namibia, commercial transactions, so oil and gas related stuff.
Mm-hmm. Now, I'm happy that you mentioned oil and gas because I see that given our industry are emerging and booming oil sectors, they would say, you took a decision to write a book, The Guide to Guyana's Local Content Act, and I have one of the copies here in my hand. Why such a decision?
Well, on the other side of my family, there are quite a few writers and lecturers. I'm actually related to Edgar Methelhalzer. And I've always had an interest since I was a boy in writing. I just translated it to technical aspect. It's not really like doing novels, but the real key motivation is people always, the first thing anybody who is trying to find out about Guyana does after the passage of the Local Content Act, the first thing they'll ask you about is local content. So I familiarized myself, I would make notes, and I realized that I could just turn those notes into a narrative form, like a book, and cover the main thing. So it's like, there are these books called The Dummy's Guide to Latin or French or any topic. So I was trying to make it like that, so it's sort of a reference book, right, where you can learn about the duties, if you're somebody coming into the sector and you're going to be a contractor, subcontractor, licensee, or if you're a Guyanese and you want to understand about what the sectors are you could benefit, what your responsibilities are, because there are responsibilities for Guyanese as well, and a bit about what the importance of local content is in the extractive industry context.
From your perspective, how uniquely different is a legal perspective, how different is our oil and gas sector from other sectors? We know it's new. What are some of the key factors?
Well, when anytime legislation is made, people always look for a reference point. So you'll see similarities with Ghana's legislation. I've seen that with Ghana is, of course, they change it very frequently, right? They have a very proactive parliament. I've always found in Ghana, with all legislation, Ghana has been very lethargic about parliamentary changes. You can see this even with labor law, right? Our Labor Act is 1940s. Our Landlord and Tenant Act is from the 1930s. The Labor Act calls for a lot of regulation, which still has not been done to this point. A lot of the things like overtime, and there are a lot of other sticky issues which oil and gas companies want to understand, because they have issues where they want people to work, longer periods for a certain amount of time, and they want to know how to navigate it. But the Labor Act is not clear on it. They're supposed to have regulations, but they have not been done by the relevant ministers. And like I said, these are historic issues. It's not a yesterday, a 5-year issue. So that's a big problem that I've noticed with Guyana. But in terms of how our legislation differs, it follows the same structure. Ours, especially with the local content, it might be a bit stricter in terms of the percentages. But you'll find similar legislation in West Africa. And other parts of the world, everybody has some sort of local content requirements. Everybody has licensing requirements. It's just a question of the nuance, what best fits our situation. But the best way to get to that is to have documentation and reports, right, where people can make decisions that this is what has happened over the last few periods, this is what we need to change. And that's where the follow-up and the regulations is where I think Guyana really lags behind.
And so you mentioned labor and the jump out, because I have many friends working in the oil and gas industry, and I know for sure that they work at 12 hours. How do they navigate? And is it the case that while we have legislation in place now governing the oil and gas industry, we haven't focused a lot on labor aspect of the industry, not local content act in that sense, ensuring that Guyanese own percentages of the various services and the companies coming out of the industry, but labor itself. Is it that we're lacking behind? Have we not meshed,
I don't, so I think based on what I've seen in the news, the government is trying to do it based on some sort of study. They might hire a consultant, they have to take, you got to get data to do these types of things.
And we're not big on data.
Yeah, but we might hire a consultant, and that consultant, you got to get questionnaires answered, you have to take surveys. All these things take time, right? And they have to be managed, the process has to be managed properly, or else you just get an assessment of the legislation without more. I figure the Bureau of Statistics has to play a part, and there has been a recent labor survey, at least in the last 5 years. But acting on that now, that seems to be the problem. That we have a problem going from we've collected this data to we are going to turn this into a regulation. We're going to turn this into an act which has to go to Parliament. I think that's where the problem lies.
Now, when Guyana passed the Local Content Act, I think it was in 2021,
yes,
it was presented as a way to ensure that Guyanese businesses and citizens would benefit from oil production rather than simply watching multinational companies dominate the sector. Legally speaking, what does the Act seek to accomplish? Where do you see it being most effective?
Okay, so local content provisions are supposed to act like a pry bar. You gotta remember there's a commercial context, which is that these companies have, it didn't just start to operate in Guyana. There's a commercial context, there are commercial relationships that these companies have, and when you implement a local content act or policy, you're saying use our businesses, even though you have your own relationships with your own suppliers, right? You have your own practices, right? Use our stuff instead. So it acts like a crowbar, right, to open opportunities. But that in itself creates friction, because you're telling people who have been doing this business, many Guyanese are not in oil and gas or have not been in oil and gas. You're telling them, use our people, right? Or use our businesses to procure stuff. So it does create friction. In addition to that, you know, we have set out minimum requirements. So the act was passed in December 31st, 2021. By 2022, we were supposed to meet the percentage requirements set out in the schedule. And the schedule is the most important part. That has 41 sectors where they're supposed to procure. All right, and it's kind of like on a sliding scale with, you know, insurance, rentals, stuff like that at the top, and then as you get lower, it's supposed to encourage joint ventures to build capacity. But now you've asked about the effectiveness, and this is one of the things that I have struggled with, because while we get some highlights, right, you'll see headlines splashed across it. We get an X amount of millions or billions of US dollars. You'll see that we're employing so many people. There are no figures that you can actually make a decision on. You just get a headline, right? The act, funnily enough, requires that an impact assessment report be commissioned on a regular basis, because a lot of these companies submit on a 5-year basis information including employment and procurement plans, how they plan to do the capacity development, put Guyanese employees first, put Guyanese employees first, get
these are the subcontractors.
Contractors and subcontractors, right? So everybody in the sector has to prepare these plans on a 5-year basis. Then every year they have to update it and say, listen, these are procurement forecasts, these are employment forecasts, this is our capacity building forecast, right? And how we intend to develop it. In addition to that, on a half-yearly basis, they have to submit and say what they have done, right? All this information has been submitted for 2022, 2023, 2024, 2025, and yet Guyana has lagged behind in commissioning a impact assessment report. Now that's supposed to be done in collaboration with the minister in charge of the sector and the local content secretariat.
Is it that there's a reluctancy, from where you stand, or it's just that we haven't found the time?
Well, I think if you look at every sector in Guyana, I mean, not recently, but at the beginning of this year, during budget debates, questions were asked about annual reports for different agencies, the Commissioner of Information, the Human Rights Commission, all these things, and they just don't seem to be, paperwork seems to be a big downfall of a lot of these agencies, keeping up with their statutory responsibilities. And in many cases, I don't think there's any penalty in the legislation. I know at least in the Local Content Act, there's no penalty for them not coming up with the impact assessment report, but we can't really determine the effectiveness of local content unless we can see exactly what is happening, right? Who's procuring why. We don't know. We know for a fact that money is flowing to these companies. We don't know if it's being retained. I think that's a point Exxon raised recently, that we have to determine how much money is staying in country.
Yes, they're going to be doing an assessment.
But the irony of that is Exxon, the foreign contractor, is doing it, but we as Guyanese are not taking the effort to take it as seriously, because 4 years have elapsed without an impact assessment report.
and so we're not able to gauge nor plan effectively. And we'll get to that because government has long said that they're going to amend or, they're reviewing.
Yeah.
I'm not sure because earlier this year I spoke to the minister and he said, you know what, well, we're now going to look and see if it's just regulations need to be updated or we need to amend the legislation itself, and we'll definitely get to that. But looking at the Local Content Act as it is, it offers a certain benefits for Guyanese companies, majority share. What are, you spoke about, pressuring major companies in a sense to develop these relationships with local companies, and the issue of fronting has emerged. Is this a major issue based on what you're hearing on the ground? Has it been resolved? Because that's what government is saying. It's saying yes, it existed in the past, but no, it's not just a major issue now. And the other thing, while you think about that, is the issue where yes, we have a joint venture relationship and we're in partnership. But I'm told that some companies, the local companies, are pressured into acquiring certain equipment and resources needed to execute whatever project from, say, a sister company of that partner. So I want you to address that fronting and how is it that the larger companies may be weaponizing or, looking at gaps within the system to their advantage.
Well, in relation to fronting, we have heard over and over from the ministry that fronting is an issue. If that is the case, and if they have evidence of fronting, they should have prosecuted at least one person. Nobody has been prosecuted.
No.
There is a section 23 of the Act allows, if there is evidence, right, for a court matter to be brought. So if they have evidence of fronting, there's nothing other than public statements which shows anything about fronting, right? Without any data, right, or without being able to pierce that veil of non-disclosure or secrecy that the Local Content Secretariat, because there's a provision which deals with providing information, right, and them having to keep information confidential unless it's for some official purpose, like I mentioned, the impact assessment report. Without having some information from them, it would just be based. Me saying anything further would be rampant speculation, right?
But for persons who do not know, because I know what is fronting, I've done an extensive report on it, I've spoken to people.
Yeah.
The thing is that they were afraid to be named because of this whole issue of being victimized. They still want to get into the industry and to operate within the industry, but then they're suffering silently as a result of some bad agreement. But for persons who are listening and who may not be au fait with what fronting really is, could you break it down for us?
Sure. So fronting is when, you have to get to the requirements of the Local Content Act. Every Guyanese business to be registered as a supplier. So you must have 51% ownership of the shares of that company. What is considered fronting is if on paper you have a majority interest, but behind the scenes you have a minority interest, and the foreign partner is really the person with the majority interest. So that's what is considered fronting.
Why would people, agree to front? Why would, a local, a local is Guyanese, but why would a Guyanese company decide, you know what? I'm going to front for this major foreign investor,
Yeah, procurement, like I said, they throw around some numbers about how much is made on a yearly basis. It is a staggering amount of money. And imagine if you're going from being, a company that has some small profits to the ability to get more without doing a lot more work. Because all you're there, because they call it in other countries, paper ownership or paper director, right? Where you are a paper shareholder, paper director, and you're getting paid for just having your name there. So it is basically free money, right? Obviously,
But
there
you
is.
see it as free money, or is the person being, placed at a disadvantage? I mean, yes, you may benefit temporarily, but what about the long term?
Well, our business culture is not as, we don't take things as serious. We have a very laissez-faire approach. There are a few big companies in Guyana, but the majority of people are small companies. Tax compliance is a big issue here. You'll often hear, if you go to any of these forums, you'll hear about banks talking about, people don't want to disclose too much information. They don't want to keep too many records because they're afraid that, GRA will be after them. So we don't have a big culture of compliance. We don't have a big culture of systems in Guyana with business. So people are just viewing it as, I'm getting this payday for a certain amount of time. I don't really have to do anything for it. But of course, there are criminal provisions if you are caught, if there's evidence against you for these types of things. So it does come with a big risk. But again, they're just looking at it as a short-term payday, right, or free money. That's my take on it from what I have seen. And even, there's an article that you did about joint ventures, and one of the guys, I think he's a guy from Farfan and Mendez, was talking about his joint venture and saying that, they came to us with something and we couldn't do it at the time. Then they came back with a smaller investment, and you have to understand that with these figures in the oil and gas sector, Guyanese don't have access to the kind of money that they would need to be a real partner.
Are you saying we still don't have access? Are you saying that companies are still finding it difficult to access the necessary resources, financial resources, to effectively partner with the foreign companies? And this, it's not a broad brush for everything. I'm sure that there are major companies that would have the resources.
Yeah.
But with respect to the new and upcoming companies,
it's difficult. If we were able to get access to finance so easily, there would be no need to have a Guyana Development Bank, right? Everybody would just go to the commercial banks. The Guyana Development Bank is going to pressure the commercial banks to drop their rates if they want to get certain loans, say 3 million or less. If they might have to compete with the government, or they might just choose to, listen, we're going to abandon loans 3 million or less and focus on 3 million and up.
Earlier you spoke about the legislation providing for persons who may engage in fronting or who are suspected of engaging in fronting to be penalized. What are some of the, evidence? Like, what do they need to have successful prosecution? Because that's the next thing. Because I could very well go as a law enforcement body and say, okay, you're accused of this and that. But then if you don't have the evidence, then it may not be successful in the courts.
Well, you see, all this is a commercial transaction. So they would have to have some evidence, either some sort of verbal recording of somebody admitting that this is not a true partnership, right, where the Guyanese has 51%, or they would have to have some documentation that shows that. That would be, those things would be conclusive evidence that the partnership is seeking to do an end around of the Local Content Act. But other than that, there would have to be some sort of investigation, and there has to be that sort of evidence. The legislation is not even that clear on how the matter goes to court, right? There's no provision. I assume or imagine it's reported to the police, and it goes to the police legal advisor or the DPP's chambers, and a charge is drafted pursuant to the act. But since nothing has happened, we will just have to wait and find out. I do think that with legislation that is not clearly criminal in its intent, as in it doesn't solely provide for criminal penalties. They should outline the route that that matter has to take so that there is no ambiguity going forward.
Mr. Glasford, as we move on, now not all partnerships are flawed or suspected to be a case of fronting. They've been successful joint ventures that we've read about in the news, and in my case written about.
Yeah.
Now this has emerged, like you said, as a result of the Local Content Act, and because of the issue of financing. Like you said, people or companies may not have all the necessary resources, the technology, and the expertise needed to effectively participate in the oil and gas sector. From your perspective, what would Guyanese business pay? What should they pay close attention to when entering a partnership with either a local company or a foreign company? Like, what should they look for? What should they guard against?
So a partnership or joint venture is a relationship, and with any relationship there's like a period of courting. Then you enter into the relationship, and then the relationship goes on over time. It might come to an end, and thus a joint venture is for a particular project. A partnership is a general thing for the life of the business. But in terms of what you need to do, due diligence, it's hard to move forward unless you know more about the people you're partnering with, the entity, the financial history of that entity. And I think these are skills that a lot of Guyanese need to focus on. I'm not sure, we don't enter into any formal financial literacy at any time during our education unless you're doing a financial program, right? Whether it's accounting or something like that. So you have to be able to look at a profit and loss statement, the cash flow statement, an annual return, audited financials, and understand what those things mean if you're getting into business with a company, right? To understand the assets they have, the liquidity, the cash flow. Are they carrying any debts, right? So that's what stops more joint ventures with Guyanese and foreign companies, because the foreign companies want to understand our financial history, and a lot of times the Guyanese companies either have no financial history or no records or a bad financial history, and the companies are not willing, the other JV partners from outside of Guyana are not accustomed to doing business in that kind of laissez-faire manner where you ask about providing these documents. The documents are not provided or not provided in a timely manner. When they are provided, they show a troubling story financially, because that's how business decisions are made in other parts of the world. We look at the documents, you decide on the temperament of your partner, you have agreements that are binding, and you go through a period of negotiation, you move forward from there. But here, there's still a lot of handshake agreements, right? And then, down the line, people get into legal issues because they made decisions without fully understanding what they're getting into. So, this is the process of fully understanding the responsibility and what you're getting into.
And Guyanese, from what I'm hearing, Guyanese businesses need to formalize or have a more structured system in place. There's benefit to that.
There is. Many people feel that you could go online and get a ChatGPT answer or find some document and just adjust it, because a lot of people do that. And just recently, a prospective client came to me, and they were having an initial consultation, and the person sharing with me, I have this commercial dispute, this person owes me this money, I signed a settlement agreement. So I asked to see the settlement agreement. The person showed me, and it was not done by a lawyer, right? And at the end of that settlement agreement, it says that this agreement is null and void, it expires. The person who owed the money had admitted, I owe this amount of money. right? And that kind of admission, you could usually go to court for and say, listen, this is in effect a promissory note. I would like to get it enforced. But at the last line of that document said, this agreement, if they don't pay by a certain time, this agreement is null and void and the parties will have to proceed to court, right?
Oh,
Which
wow.
negated the whole purpose of the document. And people find a lot of templates, people find ChatGPT things and think that it can replace the expertise of a human, but it can't. And one of the things people don't understand about ChatGPT is it just pulls stuff off the internet. So, and Guyana is a very opaque society. There's not a lot of accurate information on the internet about Guyana. So, I've searched for stuff on Google. The first thing comes up is an AI mode. I was looking for some electricity act. And what came up was the Trinidad Act, or that's what they were citing as the reference when you asked about electricity reforms in Guyana. Trinidad Act came up. But people, unless you look at the sources, wouldn't know that, and they'll think this is the position for Guyana. And a lot of the time when you look for ChatGPT stuff, it just pulls stuff from different parts of the world.
So is it that it's important, when going into these major partnerships or in joint ventures, it's important to have on your side somebody with a legal expertise or a lawyer, an attorney?
Yes, but people don't. Any service professional will tell you, and it's very prevalent in Guyana. The problem is selling the invisible because you don't provide a tangible service, right? You might be providing a well-researched 1, 2, 3, 5-page thing, but people just see it as 5 pieces of paper you handed me and you charge me X for it, right? If you're providing,
they don't want to pay.
Well, they don't see the value. It's not that they don't want to pay. Some people will see the value and pay, even though they might have an issue with the fees you charge. But then there are people who just don't. The problem is the people who just don't see the value in the service you're providing. They think that, I could get this done myself. So, and that's what they do. But then you realize later.
You got to hire a lawyer, got to go to court.
But we have a very reactionary way of dealing with things, right? But businesses in other parts of the world, when I was working with this Spanish firm, a lot of the companies that are working in the sector, they want to, before they ever enter, they will ask for, an advisory on setting up the company, an advisory on local content, an advisory on taxation, advisory on every single thing you could possibly think of. If they have an issue with their employees, before they come to a position, they will ask you, tell us about overtime, tell us about this, tell us about that, tell us about the labor regime, right? Even before they bring people into the country, they will ask for an opinion on these things. They have a very proactive way of dealing with things, and they're not surprised. But in Guyana, you're often, people come to you, right? This person filed a lawsuit against me. 6 months might have elapsed, right? And they come to you a few days before
the court case.
Yeah, I need to get this done. And then they're expecting you to be a magician and wave a wand and just come up with what needs a solution.
So we definitely need to work on that. Now, what are some of the legal pitfalls that local companies may overlook when negotiating with much larger international firms? Some of the things they take for granted. I know you talk about, the tax, look at the balance sheet and things like that, but what are some of the other issues that, you must consider?
Yeah, so they will always ask, in the majority of cases with any true partnership, they'll ask for an agreement, and that agreement has to be reviewed very carefully, right? What is the liability for any joint venture? Because liability to something can slow a project down significantly and cause cost overrun. So is it going to be fault-based liability, or what they call knock for knock, which is that both parties agree that they will look after their liability and not necessarily look at that at the point when the incident happens. Say if you have damage to equipment, right? The person who owns that will look after it, and then they'll deal with the fault later, right? Things like the liability, any indemnity clauses, the profit split, the work split, any agreement for, if it's going to be a joint venture company, any agreement for acquisition of assets, if they're going to be shares, the shareholder agreements, any clauses in relation to dilution of shares, because that's a big issue. You might have 51% at a point in time, but it's certainly possible to bring in new shareholders, and if there's no anti-dilution clause, right, you could be diluted down below 51%. So all those things are necessary for bringing in new investors to understand that.
And that's important because I think I heard of a case, I know of a case in which, somebody started up a company, then they brought in a partner, and then before you know it, the person is left without a company. Do you hear a lot of those cases happening because maybe they did not have the proper legal and structure framework in place to guard against these things?
Well, it's certainly possible. I have not heard. I mean, in Guyana, you always hear of stories, anecdotes, but I try not to make conclusions based on anecdotes. You see, like when you did your story, you interviewed people and you got first-hand information from people who were involved in a joint venture, right? And that is acceptable. But without some sort of data or first-hand information, I wouldn't make decisions or make conclusions based on anecdotes.
But do you think the legal environment adequately at this stage protect local businesses, particularly the small businesses, as they enter these partnerships?
There is provision. That's what the local content secretariat is there for, right? Because businesses that say, I've been disenfranchised in this procurement, it wasn't carried out fairly, right, by an oil and gas company, can go and complain. But you have to remember that a lot of these things are based on leverage, right? And the Guyanese companies don't have the type of leverage or bargaining power in a lot of circumstances that they really should. And that plays a big part, because sometimes you can be strong-armed into taking a position that you don't necessarily want to, and you're concerned about your livelihood. So, as you mentioned, when people come to talk to you about a joint venture, they don't want to be named because they're concerned about perhaps being blacklisted, perhaps companies not wanting to do business with them. So all those things have to be taken into consideration.
Now, this is a very extensive book that you've done here on local content, the Local Content Act, a guide to Guyana's Local Content Act. Now, clearly, you've studied it. And when we started this interview, I said government indicated that they're reviewing the legislation to see where there may be gaps. But from where you stand, based on your assessment, what are some of the key recommendations you would put forward? And I know that you spoke earlier about not having necessary regulations in place, but sum it up for us. Like, what are some of the key things? I know the schedule caters, you said 4 to 1, I think it's 4 to 2.
Yeah, well, they
right?
separate one into two.
Okay,
right? So trucking and transportation services should be two companies, two separate sectors, but they say just 27A or 28A and B. But I consider it two separate things.
Okay. All right. So they're now looking at that schedule to see the list of services there and whether there is need, whether we've built capacity in other sectors to include those services on that schedule, update the schedule. But what more must be done to ensure that Guyanese are effectively participating in the oil and gas sector, not just fronting and, that these joint ventures are working for both sides and that we benefit, because the intention is to ensure that Guyanese benefit from our natural resources.
Yeah. So there are a few things. First, to know if we're benefiting or to know where the schedule is at, we have to see the data. The only way we can see the data is with the impact assessment report. I don't know if you're aware, but I think sometime in 2025 or late 2024, the Private Sector Commission commissioned a document. And in that document, they said, based on their research and their empirical data, they are suggesting that the local content schedule be expanded by about 20 sectors, right? But there is no data right? The data that they need to support it is the data that the local content secretariat has, because you'll often hear the directors of local content, because there've been two so far. You'll often hear the Minister of Natural Resources talk about,
whether we have capacity.
no, but they're saying that we have increased our capacity because
Yeah.
foreign companies are not only procuring services based on the list of 40. They say that they are doing
beyond.
other sectors, but we need that information to know if there's actual capacity. We need to see, if there's a master service agreement in place, if they're still using those companies years on, right? We need information from those companies to see, well, the scope of the contract. Has it increased? Did they just try those companies once and turned out that they provided exceptional service or substandard service? We don't know any of these particulars, and that's what you need to determine if we have in fact increased our capacity in certain areas, right? Those sectors that have very low percentages, have Guyanese even gotten any of those contracts? Say like there's something with maybe it's like 5%. There are a few at like 5-10%. Have Guyanese gotten it? And the only people who know the answer to those questions are the local content secretariat, right? And without this impact assessment, or again, we're due for about 3 impact assessments.
Is it that they have the impact assessment and they haven't made it public, or they have the data and they're advising the ministry? So when it's time to amend the legislation, they'll be able to amend it appropriately.
Yeah, but it is not something that should be a public discussion, because the private sector is clearly saying by producing this report that this is something that the private sector, the GCCI, should have a say in.
Yeah.
But if they don't have the information, how can they make effective representations?
Yeah, and I remember the minister saying earlier when I spoke to him, well, a group of reporters spoke to him on this issue, he said that, when they were crafting the first legislation and dealing with the schedule, person said that they had capacity, and then when they really assess those services that we probably at that time did not have the capacity, now we've increased capacity. So it's important, like you said, to have the assessment, to have data, to be driven. Our decision ought to be driven by data and a comprehensive assessment of the sector. Do you see now that we've spoken about oil and gas, but do you see other companies approaching, for example yourself, to develop joint ventures in other sectors like the mining industry, or is it just oil and gas concentrated?
Nah, it's become popularized because of oil and gas, right? So that's the best way for companies coming into Guyana for a path to be local content compliant, to have a joint venture. But joint ventures have been prevalent in the mining sector long before oil and gas, right? And, people come frequently because the expertise, there's a lot of expertise among Brazilians, miners, and, they partner with the Guyanese because the legislation requires that, only certain concessions can go to Guyanese, right? Or a Guyanese in joint venture. So it's been popular for many years now to do joint ventures in the mining sector. And, that's something people come to lawyers for fairly often to do.
Okay. Now, one of the, like we've spoken about, the stated objective is to ensure that Guyanese are participating in the sector, whether it's oil, well, in this case, it's oil and gas for the long run. They're talking about long-term and development and enabling Guyanese businesses to be more competitive in this particular sector. When it comes to law and beyond that, what are some of the commercial barriers that you see exist that may prevent businesses from developing?
The biggest barrier is know-how. Even when people come, so what I've realized over time, when people come to me for advice in relation to businesses and companies, etc., they just think you get the documents, the forms and notices of incorporation, the articles, the certificate of incorporation, and that's the end of the story. Most people don't realize, I have to keep these records. I have to issue shares, for the company. I have to do a beneficial ownership declaration. I have to file annual returns every year. Annual returns are a big deal for banking relations. I have to have a bank account, right? To get a bank account, I need to provide these documents. I have to have cash flow projections. If it's a new business, I have to have projections of what your income and expenditure will be. If you have an existing business, you have to provide a few years of your income and expenditure and cash flow to the bank, right? And statements from an accountant. So it's not, people just think, and that's why when I try to assist people, right, I try and make sure I give them comprehensive things so they could understand, they can know for the first year these are the things that you have to do. So I provide that advice, right? I try and provide them or create a package where they have the documents they need to get through the first 18 months, right? Understanding that they have to do an annual general meeting or a resolution to the effect of an annual general meeting, the annual returns, the corporate income tax, all these things. And, that's just surviving the first 18 months, right? When you want to get capital injection, access the bank, having what they call a bankable project or a credit-worthy project. All those things, you either have to go to an accountant or a lawyer, and those are those are things people don't like to hear, that you need help, you need advice. We seem to have a cultural identity that you think you could do everything yourself, right? So those are a lot of the issues that you see with companies developing.
Now, another issue is that of finance, and I think you mentioned it in passing. This is a big challenge. When you go to the conferences, you hear people say, well, yeah, the opportunities exist, but access to finance. How big is this issue from what you've heard? Well,
it's really big, but it's really big because people don't have, there's no compliance culture, right? The things that you need to access finance are, the documents that help with compliance, the documents that show your financial health, your financial history. Because banks in Guyana are I don't know if risk averse is the right term, but everything, only recently we started to do invoice factoring, but you have to have commercial relations in place, right? Or you and a company have to have commercial relationships, and then the bank will finance based on that agreement. But what happens if you don't have that? The only thing the bank is willing to accept is land as collateral, right? Or immovable property as collateral usually. So that I think that is one of the major issues. So there's they have to manage their risk, because when they lend money, they just want to collect the principal and the interest. They don't want to have to get into selling your asset to get back their money, because then they have to have an execution sale or an auction that has a cost to it. They have to go to court. Even if it's just to, like I mentioned with the pro note or a voluntary condemnation, it still costs something to go to high court to get an order saying, yes, you can sell this asset, right? Then they have to have that. Then when they do sell it, right, they can only get back what they're owed. Then they have to give you the rest. So it's a lot of administrative and technical steps between here and there. And then Guyana's, like I said, I mentioned, Guyana's business culture is kind of laissez-faire. So it's a matter of trust. It's a matter of risk assessment and mitigation and compliance, and we don't have a compliance culture.
So in order to better position ourselves, we must ensure that we are compliant and have the necessary systems in place.
And the understanding, it starts with the knowledge of what you have to do. Because if you don't know, you can't do anything.
You can't do. Now, earlier you mentioned, and it's important for us to talk about this, you spoke about the development bank that the government is moving to establish, and how that is in a sense intended to put pressure on the commercial banks. And government said, we want to ensure that Guyanese have access to resources? What are some of the big things because people hear about commercial banking, they're all excited. Do they need the same requirements as in the case of going to the commercial banks? What's the difference between the two?
Okay, I don't think the intention is to pressure the commercial bank. I think the effect will be to pressure them. But in terms of what you need, anybody who is familiar with government procurement knows that there's a lot of time involved. There's a lot of paperwork involved. It's not going to be you just go with your documents and your business plan and your loan proposal and you'll get the money. I don't think so. People, in the Small Business Act, there's provision for grants. I think people are thinking about it like a grant, but the legislation itself speaks to them wanting to collect the money, right?
They have to repay it.
Yeah, it'll have to be repaid. It has to be for the purpose that it's intended for, right? You can only get a certain amount. It's going to be reviewed and approved. I'm sure they're going to be binding legal documents that you're going to have to sign, right? And if you don't pay back, I'm sure there'll be penalties, and they will come after you for the money. That's based on my reading of the legislation.
Have you had a chance to, well, you said in your reading of the legislation, so I know that you've had a chance to read it. How strong do you see that legislation? Do you think that there's room for it to be amended before passage?
That's a political decision, right? And from what I've seen of our parliament, unless there's some public outcry, like there was with the sexual offense registry, it's unlikely that it changes. A lot of bills, because of the majority.
In Parliament.
There's unlikely to be changes to it, unless there's some massive flaw that the public find in some human outcry.
What are your thoughts of it? You think it's a strong piece that is heading to the House, that is before the House, it's already there.
Well, I've been looking to see if there are any comparable legislation. I think that, again, you come back to the issue of regulations and guidelines, right? Because you can have a piece of legislation that is not extremely detailed, but you have detailed regulations and guidelines. But Guyana often has a problem with producing regulation and guidelines. I don't know if you remember the Ramps logistics case.
Yes.
Ramps still has its local content certificate, but one of the things that came out of that decision is that they met the statutory requirements. There was no reason for the denial of the certificate, and the Chief Justice had asked at that time, what about the regulations under this act? There's still no regulations on the Local Content Act, right? So those are issues. You see, it's not about whether the bill is perfect or not. It's about the swiftness with which an error can be corrected if there is a problem. And we don't have that capacity here, at least from, the public instances, like I've given some examples of.
Now, overall, when you look at the legal framework governing the oil and gas sector, where do you see us making, and I know you spoke about the gaps, but where do you see us making the greatest progress? And which of the areas remain very vulnerable?
And you gotta give me some more context for that.
Now, where do you see us making progress in the sense, yes, we've been able to have, but then again, you reference to data and the absence of data. But the question is based on, do you see us effectively or having effective joint ventures in place? Do you see that there are more Guyanese becoming business owners within the sector and subsectors, all the other sectors that have developed since? And where are some of the areas that, well, you spoke about the gaps, you spoke about the absence of data, the absence of an impact assessment, but what other areas may need attention? We spoke about local content. We spoke about local content, and we spoke about it under review, but outside of local content, when you look at the sector in its entirety, whether it has to do with the environment, whether it has to do with labor. Now, some people believe that, you know what, yes, Guyanese are being employed in the sector, but are they being paid on the same level as the foreign nationals? Are they being compensated adequately? And are there legislation in place to ensure that should any harm come to them, that they will be appropriately compensated? Along that line, I know it's said a lot.
Okay, so in terms of businesses, we know that more businesses are being created than in previous years. You know, every few months you get in the Gazette, it talks about new companies that were created, and you know, in 2023 we were at 18,000 and something, or sometime in 2024. Now we're at 19,000, right? So companies are being created, business name registrations are being registered every day, right, in massive numbers. The flip side of that is companies, non-compliant companies, are also being taken off the register and record numbers. In February the 14th of this year, almost 1,500 companies were deregistered, right? That's part of the story that you don't often hear about. And again, it's because of the compliance issues that I mentioned, or people not knowing what has to be done, thinking that the registration of the company is the end all and be all. In terms of labor...
Before you go to labor, you're saying that this year, over 1,500 companies were deregistered. What were some of the reasons for them?
They don't give a reason. Well, it's always for lack of filing annual returns and lack of beneficial ownership declaration.
But does it mean that they can't operate any longer? They cease operation?
It means they lose their
ability to bid.
They lose their structure. They lose their liability protection. It is no longer effective. If you look at the Gazette, the official Gazette from February 14th, 2026, you'll see a long list of 1,400 companies. And the thing is, all of them were between 11,000 and 12,000, fairly recent incorporations, right? It's not like it's stuff from the 1990s, it's stuff from the 2000s, or companies from sometime, between 2000 and 2020.
But what is this telling you about the environment or the landscape, or what is happening?
It's telling you people don't know what they're supposed to do. They're not aware, or they're choosing not to do it. That's the only reasonable conclusion to draw from that.
And there are major implications. I'm trying to understand.
Well, there's major implications for people who create a company. Now, imagine you spend a few $100,000 creating a company, right? You spend money creating marketing plans, employing people, acquiring assets, and then you don't do what's necessary for your company to stay in existence. It's a waste of time and money. So that's the implication. The companies, they're that's all I could say on that.
You were about to address the issue of labor and compensation.
Yeah. There is a mechanism through the Ministry of Labor to have complaints made, and sometimes the matters go to court with foreign companies and local employees, and sometimes judgments are awarded for the employee, sometimes they're awarded in favor of the foreign company.
I know the case, and this was not publicized because the applicant chose not to, but it was a case in which when workers, they go offshore and then they come back, I think early on they were not being paid for the period that they spent at home, right? And I think someone challenged the company, and they won that. To say, the court said, you know what, if this person is hired by you, you have to pay them, even when they're at home. And I think that's something that people don't know. In some companies in the early parts, I don't know if they're still doing it, but persons were not being compensated for their entire stint, their operation.
Well, you see, the onus lies on the individual, right, to I'm not sure if the right word is to be aware, but to realize that something might be amiss here and question it. The second thing is it lies on the labor officials to periodically check and ensure, right? Let people know if you have an issue, come to us and let us know what the issue is. And of course, in lieu of that, people choose to go to a lawyer and say, hey, something is not right here. This is my situation. Do I have a case? And then the lawyer will take it to court. But ideally, it should be dealt with at the level of the employee and the company. If it needs to be escalated further, it should then go to the Ministry of Labor. And if the person still feels that they have not got a satisfactory outcome, then they can take private action. But I think that's the way it needs to be escalated.
Mr. Glasford, you wrote this book. There's another book that you wrote as well.
Yeah, so I wrote a book on powers of attorney, which was published on the 30th of March 2026. Okay. And that kind of goes through what a power of attorney is, the different types we have here, how to use them, what the duties are, because a lot of people don't know the duties that come with power of attorney. So an agent takes on a big responsibility when they choose to be an attorney, or a power of attorney, an agent for a person. And I don't think that people are aware. We treat it like if it's a favor transaction, which is, just do 1, 2 things for me. Just take this power of attorney. I don't know if you've ever experienced it, but...
No, not at all.
Yeah.
But, yeah. So, what's next for you? Are you writing another book?
I have plans to write some more. I work, as you know, I'm a practicing lawyer here, so there's always that. I do some radio engagements. Okay.
And go mostly radio, of course.
Yes, I have my own public information that I share on TikTok and Instagram. So it's more...
And what's the name of your website, just in case person? I know lawyers cannot advertise, but what's the name of the website?
I have 2. I have one for my practice, which is mckaylaw.co. And I have one where I publish these informational stories called sidebargy.com.
Sidebargy, that's it.
Yeah.
All right, so if you want to know more about Mr. Glasford's work and some of the things he's been offering, quite a lot of information, valuable information to help you in whether it's a business venture you're launching or getting involved in anything, do check his website out on sidebargy.com. I got it right?
Yeah. Also, my TikTok page is very active.
Yeah, I saw up to last night. I saw you talking about joint ventures on TikTok, which is good. Yeah. So keep up the awesome work. And
my TikTok handle is sidebargy or Brenden Glasford. But I'm more active on the TikTok or Instagram right now. I'm working, writing of course is a lot of work, and finding the appropriate stories to cover is almost, it's almost a form of journalism. But it's at like the level of a personal blog right now. But yeah, I do try and focus right now on the videos. I try and do 1 or 2 written pieces a week. Yeah, but that's pretty much it.
So thank you so much for sharing. Closing remarks.
Compliance, knowing what you're getting into before you get into it, reading the documents that you're going to sign before you sign them. These are things that people don't often consider. On the local content thing, we really do need to see some figures, right, to make proper decisions about the local content moving forward. The impact assessment report is going to be critical in any proper decision-making process.
Mr. Glasford, thank you so much for sitting with me here on Sources. I wish you all the best as you craft your next book and you continue to offer valuable insight and advice on your TikTok page. And to our viewers, thank you so much for watching. I've been your host, Svetlana Marshall. Do join us next week, same time, same place, for another edition of Sources. Stay well.